Welcome back from lunch or brunch or very late supper in Europe. I can guarantee you will not regret it. So our next keynote speaker is one of the most awarded leaders due to his great achievements over the past 20 years in government and private sector. He served as CIO, CEO, CTO, and more recently, since 2018, André Mendes is the CIO of the U.S. Department of Commerce. So without further ado, to allow the maximum time in front of the microphone to André, please join me on welcoming André Mendes. André, please take it.
Hopefully you can see it and you're good to go. Let me know otherwise, but otherwise I'm going to start. Okay, so about this presentation, there's a few things you should know. First of all, the title is deliberately deceptive, and I'll explain why. Second, the presentation is deliberately provocative, and so you'll see nuggets where it might question some of your long-held beliefs. The opinions therein are mine and mine alone, so no responsibility should be apportioned to anybody else, including, of course, the Department of Commerce. And caveat emptor, I speak extemporaneously, and so I might mention a company or two. Sometimes I do, sometimes I don't. And as a result, please be forewarned that it's not an endorsement. And if you decide to either buy or sell the shares of that company because you heard it here, that is entirely on you. Okay, so let's get started. So, deliberately deceptive title. There are no such things as non-turbulent times. History is nothing more than the account of previous turbulence. We document war, disasters, conquests, murders, deaths, births, and changes, all mostly negative items, or at least in a negative light. It rarely documents peace and happiness, and then only as precursors for all of the other items that we've talked about, because it's so strange to have that type of circumstance. News, what you read, listen to, and see every day is the history of current turbulence. And if you will notice, it's mostly negative. The positives are so rare that they're actually pre-announced, at the end of a 30-minute local news. And now for a feel-good story, let's go to so-and-so whose cat was up the tree, but it was retrieved by a fireman. So, they are pre-announced. They're so rare. And also, they have changed in nature. Our grandparents got news locally, nearby. If Aunt Melissa sprained her ankle, that was a big event, right? All of a sudden, those became local news, and then regional, and then national, and then continental, and now global. And not only global, but also now. You can literally get news from across the world on your phone, on your computer, in real time. And that is something that has created an enormous amount of additional turbulence, even in the midst of all of this information. Now, science, for example, is little more than the understanding of natural turbulence, right? Weak and strong forces from physics, movement and acceleration, genesis and decay in the biological arena, all about turbulence and change. Life itself is turbulence. If you do not have turbulence, you are dead, because even as you sit there and listen to this presentation, there's an enormous amount of turmoil going on inside of your body that is necessary in order for you to live. Mitosis and apoptosis, so cell birth and cell death, are all turbulence. Births and deaths are incredibly violent events most of the time. Prey and predator relationships and healing and decay, all turbulence. Child and parent relationships, absolutely turbulent. Government and opposition, turbulence all the time. Victory and defeat, it is nothing but change and turbulence. So in the midst of all of this, what is leadership? Well, leadership is actually about creating and managing turbulence. Leadership is always about change. Without leadership, we simply manage entropic decay. It's management, and it's nothing to do with leadership and progress. If you look at primitive tribes, even today, they are mostly devoid of leadership, and they rely on precedent. And that is one of the reasons why they're actually still primitive. Now, one might argue that it's a much better lifestyle, but that's a different proposition altogether that we're not touching here. Early history leaders ruled by strength and agility, right? From the caves, to almost the Middle Ages. The strongest ruled by force, and as a result of being the leaders, they select mates, and as a result, they genetically select upward to be stronger, and therefore continue to occupy roles of leadership. Later, leaders started ruling by guile and manipulation. So with the intellect development that places a premium on smarts, it also places a premium on deception. And so you see all of the internecine warfare that develops from that intra-country, intra-state, intra-family, that is so well documented in the history, right? And then you have authoritarians that rule by subversion of institutions, right? They subvert the military, they subvert the courts, they subvert government and constructs. One of the best examples recently is in Venezuela, where you might not know this, but there are actually, or there were at the time, 325 generals in the Venezuelan military, right? Far more than existed in any country of the same size. Why? Because the military needed to be subverted. You see the same thing with courts and governmental constructs whenever there is some kind of attempt at manipulation. Now, modern leaders rule by consensus, which is, an interesting proposition. It takes, it is represented by representative republics, by democracies, and even within organizations by fiat or by laws, that generate that consensus, but in an orderly fashion. Now, there is a power and danger of consensus because ever-present change poses both opportunities and risks. Consensus of the status quo is almost always a very dangerous proposition. Why? Because things change so quickly. So as you continue to assume the status quo, effectively what you are doing is creating a situation where you're falling behind all of the competition that is continuing to evolve. And it tends to arise through weak or inexistent leadership, risk-averse leadership, comfortable leadership, which is actually not leadership at all. It's actually the opposite. It is the lack of leadership that leads to organizations becoming stale, to organizations becoming outdated, and often to the death of those organizations. One of the best examples, of course, is Polaroid, that was a market leader by any stretch of the imagination, right? And all of a sudden, it almost disappeared because it decided it didn't want to invest heavily into the digitalization of photography. Everybody knows that. Everybody knows about the computer, companies that bet on hardware, proprietary hardware, and proprietary software, and that as a result basically almost cease to exist. The compacts of the world, the decks of the world, for those of you who are old enough to remember those names. So it is often comfortable even as it becomes suicidal, not a willing suicide, but eventually effectively a suicide by lack of action, by omission, so to speak. Contrast 3 IBM leaders. Watson, at its inception, the CEO of IBM, was a man that was absolutely driven by the pursuit of excellence, the pursuit of innovation, and also the pursuit of wealth. As a result, he created an organization that broke all of the barriers and that became the standard for the computing world. Now, go forward, about 40, 50 years, and you have a gentleman by the name of John Akers, who absolutely felt very comfortable in the fact that mainframes were an enormous source of revenue and that they were all in all likelihood going to live forever and that they were going to be the dominant platform. And of course, this was a tremendous mistake, right? That put all of IBM at risk in the early to mid 80s. And so on board, after they got rid of Akers and had a couple of interim leaders, comes Lou Gerstner, totally from a background outside of the computing environment, didn't know anything about technology beyond what a normal executive in another organization, he came from the food industry, would know. But he knew that the paradigms were changing and that change was absolutely necessary in order for a behemoth like IBM to survive and to actually thrive. And so he went about meeting with all of the executives from IBM, and I can assure you that he was not looking for consensus in the normal way in which we use the word. He was looking for people who were willing to change alongside with him, and he was also perfectly willing to get rid of the people that did not want to change and wanted to stay in the old paradigm. Three completely different individuals at different stages in the organization, and the reality is that Lou Gerstner enabled IBM to not only survive and thrive in a completely different business paradigm. So leaders reach consensus by driving it, not by having everybody agree by virtue of prolonged discussion, but by having an end game in mind and then building consensus and selling that consensus to the rest of the organization, so that a consensus is indeed reached, but it is a consensus that is directed, that has a vector, and that therefore can then implement with momentum. They risk disturbing the status quo. And that is one of the most essential things, if you take nothing from this presentation but this, risk disturbing the status quo. Okay? They know or think they know the end game. And knowing the end game is a very interesting exercise in abstraction and in thinking, because it requires that you remove all of your own internal barriers in order to get to a desired state. They often lose the ability and the will to disrupt by virtue of the circumstances. They become comfortable. And sometimes early success actually leads to that stage setting in earlier, and therefore curtailing their careers or curtailing the life of their organization. And you see people that go from iconoclasts to dinosaurs in a few years. And this affects just about everybody. So this is what I call easing into inconsequential, a very, very dangerous trait for individuals that find themselves in positions of executive leadership. Let me give you an example. In 1986, I started working at General Health Incorporated. Disruption was my main name. I had nothing to risk. You know, I was a 25-year-old kid, no mortgage, no kids, and basically I could afford to do anything. Find another job, you know, go through life, you know, sort of in a carefree way, right? What happened? There was a business model at General Health that involved, you know, Mark Sense questionnaires that were mailed out. They were filled out by the individuals. They came back in, they were analyzed, and there was a report that was mailed out again. Enormous expense, a tremendous amount of time going through all of these issues. You know, only for the end result to arrive finally at this individual's house that would describe their health risks and their expected life expectancy, right? Calculated life expectancy. I thought that that was crazy. I suggested that we should use IBM PCs to collect the data. We actually used the light pen at the time for that to be sent over a modem, at the time a Reykjavik 1200, into our mainframe. And that furthermore, we should analyze the results immediately and send back a summary with all of the health risks that would then be complemented by a report at a later date that was far more elegant, you know, a brochure, very colorful and far more meaty, that they could hold on an ongoing basis. The CEO loved it, but the IT manager at the time, the director of IT, thought it was a terrible idea, that it was very risky, he didn't want to do it. 6 months later, I had his position, right? And so here was a case where an individual comes in, has new ideas, and runs against resistance on the part of an established leader, and ends up disposing of that leader, not by intention, but just by happenstance, because of bringing innovation into the table. So go 12 years later at PBS. I was the CIO, and we were running a very large infrastructure of Sun Solaris on Sun servers, running a massive web presence, because PBS had been an early adopter and it was one of the most you know, popular websites. And one of my programmers came to me and said, Andre, you know, we could save an enormous amount of money if we went to regular PC servers with Intel chips using Linux. And I shut it down. I basically said, no, that's too risky. You know, I don't know who's going to provide me service in the middle of the night. I'm not going to be able to do that. And I went home and I woke up in the middle of the night in a cold sweat because I had seen this movie before. And this movie ended up with the CIO being replaced for lack of vision. We went back and we implemented a big, large array of Intel-based PCs running Linux and saved an enormous amount of money. Now, here's to tell you that this young kid of 25 that had no encumbrances was perfectly willing to drive innovation. But this 37-year-old CIO that now had a mortgage and a kid and all kinds of expenses had settled into comfort and was not willing to risk his career, his job, in order to pursue an innovative solution out of fear, out of status quo. That lesson was learned in a jiffy, and I've been using it for the rest of my life. The danger of financial indenture is that you become afraid of taking risks. And when you become risk averse, you are your own worst enemy. Refuse to become inconsequential. Okay? It has got to be a deliberate decision that you're always going to be on the cusp, because the cusp is constantly moving faster and faster and faster. The status quo is always the biggest threat, because as you languish in your status quo, there are all kinds of individuals, all kinds of organizations that are stretching the limits because they have that ability to drive innovation and to have a carefree attitude about where they're going to go. So lead the disruption or be obsolete. Okay? Now, I talked about end games. Understanding end games. You have to make some assumptions. You have to assume unlimited CPU, GPU storage, and bandwidth, period. That is like the baseline that you have to do from a technology standpoint, right? Virtual reality, total and complete geographic abstraction until we end up with avatars in a virtual world, and that's where we're going to end up. A predicted future, for those of you who are science fiction fans, if you read Foundation and Empire by Isaac Asimov, you will know that psychohistory is basically predicting the future based on trillions of behavioral observations and then a mapping of what is likely to happen with a high degree of certainty, because the pool of knowledge from which you are extracting your predictions is so vast, right? Nanotech, right? The fact that nanobots are going to be an eventual consequence, up to and including having nanobots in intracellular DNA regeneration that effectively stop the aging process, right? Health, total genome understanding, total proteome understanding, total understanding of glycosylation, so that you know all of the metabolic pathways that create life and that create aging, so that you can modify them and take control over your health. Like immortality, via the above health and nanotech. It is not a matter of if, it's a matter of when, right? And I'm not saying it's desirable, but it's going to be the consequence. Energy, and this is where I throw in a little controversy, right? Scalable controlled nuclear fusion, right? It's going to be eventually the paradigm that powers the entire universe. But what about cybersecurity? What is the end game in cybersecurity? So we've had a history of methods: controlled physical access, user ID and password, VPNs, patterns for identification, PIV cards, retinal scans, facial recognition, voice prints, multi-factor authentication, and of course now ZTA, which you guys have been discussing, and that is without a shadow of a doubt where we need to be in the very near future to stay ahead of our competition or detractors, right? But that is not going to be the end game, right? All evolutionary steps, but as paradigms change, we have gotten all of this evolution of protocols, but it's going to continue because we always thought we had the end game, but we never did, right? And ZTA will not be the end game. So ICAM end game, my version, okay? And you can take it for what it's worth. Borderless ad hoc mesh networks using IPv something, right? The next iteration, and operating on a global basis, on a galactic basis, because eventually that's where we're going to be. Humans become a part of the Internet of Things, okay? And that is potentially a controversial concept, but it's a reality, I believe, right? Imprinting, right? The actually having the ability to recognize who you are is actually going to be mandated in a soft way for overall access. Because if you cannot access any of the functions of society unless you are recognized by the network at large, as a viable member of that network, you're not going to be able to access anything. I mean, you could return to being a primitive individual in a primitive setting, but the overwhelming majority of people will choose not to do that, right? So although it's mandated, it's a soft mandate by necessity if you want to participate, right? We are going to eventually get to the point where there's going to be a DNA-generated MAC address, the equivalent of a MAC address for authentication. Of course, this will include, eventually the implant of a chip or multiple chips, but I think that that's a given as well. Multiple entity complex authorization. So we go from an authentication that is of a single individual to an environment where there are multiple entities, individuals, organizations that are going to be in real time controlling authorizations for access with immediate biology-like feedback loops, right, that allow for a response, continuous response to attempts of entry or illegal entry, right? Eventually, I believe we're going to get to a clearance score for access control, granting, or revocation that is going to be fed by these biological feedback loops and that operate in real time in order to give you access to any of the information that you'd like to access. Because one of the biggest dangers, of course, is always the insider threat, right? Once we resolve all of the other issues in terms of individuals that we don't want to come in, or organizations or computer systems, then we get the fact that we might have some internal issues, right? And the history of the world is largely formulated around internecine warfare within families, within countries, within organizations, right? And so you're going to combine that with a predicted future based on what we just talked about, trillions upon trillions of observations, so we can see pattern recognition of routes or precursors or attempts at access of different areas that will be immediately signaled for and might include immediate revocation of your access status, right? And by the way, to a certain degree, we're already doing that in a couple of things. If you go, let's say you steal a credit card and you go into a gas station and you put in just $1 just to see if the credit card has been rejected yet. If that happens, with a credit card, the system at Visa, MasterCard, American Express is immediately going to put a warning on that card. And if there's another transaction that seems out of whack, they will immediately shut it down, right? A predicted future based on billions of observations, trillions of observations. So the question then becomes, what is your vision of the ICAM endgame? Have you thought about it in those terms? Right? Understanding the destination illuminates the path that we need to run through in order to get there. Does your current roadmap extend past the next stop? Or did we think about ZTA? And that's all we're thinking about, right? And I know it's difficult to continually look at the future past what we're trying to accomplish when we haven't accomplished yet. But the reality is that ZTA will not be the end all be all. And we need to start looking and thinking from an end game of what the next step is going to be, so that we can remove temporary bottlenecks from the strategic vision of what that end game is, right? Every operational decision must fit into that strategic plan that is driven by your end game, right? And every strategy mandate must have immediate action so that you have this commingling of strategy and operational environments that are totally and completely interdependent, and as a result, continue to move progress forward. You must drive consensus. Do not settle for reaching it. Reaching consensus by a large group without direction can be often as wrong as not reaching a consensus at all. So you got to make sure that you have enough thought put into it if you're in a position of leadership so that you drive the consensus tactfully, carefully, looking for all of the other options that come to the table and considering them in terms of the end game or how it might change it, but nevertheless driving it and not just sitting back and letting it happen. You must stay iconoclastic. All of you that are listening to this presentation either are or were iconoclasts. They were ready to change the world because you knew better, in terms of where we needed to go, right? Stay that way. Do not become comfortable. Do not let yourself stew in a ever hotter water that will eventually boil you, like the proverbial frog. It is much safer to stay iconoclastic. because the world continues to change at a tremendous speed. And if you don't, you will fall behind. And with that, that's all I have for you today. Be glad to entertain questions to the degree that Michaela and the team are going to allow me. I know Michaela is following me with, exhibiting the extraordinary leadership that she has put behind OSCAL. And so I don't want to take anything away from her time. And with that, I go back to you.